we can get started. All right, well, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry we're in a different place and we had some few little snafus, but we got it going. We're online, and I'd like to, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Molly Mersmann. Her PhD is from Purdue University, and she's an assistant professor of American history at Marshall, specializing in the American Civil War and Reconstruction eras. She earned, as we said, her PhD in 2022 from Purdue and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Virginia Tech before joining Marshall as the university's Civil War historian. Dr. Mersmann's research interests include women and gender, African American history, and Civil War memory. Her book manuscript, Repair, Restore, Rebuild, Reconstructing the South in the Wake of the American Civil War, examines how Southerners rebuilt their landscapes, societies, and lives after the war, and the allies they looked to in that process. In recognition of her teaching, she received Marshall's Pickens Queen Award in 2025. Very impressive. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. How are we all? Good? Good.
Beautiful day.
It is a pretty day. So thank you so much to Elizabeth for organizing this. As she said, my name is Dr. Molly Mersmann, and you have the unfortunate experience of seeing me twice. So I'll be here this week and next week. So I'm sorry about that. But today we're going to talk about my research, which is something that I rarely get to talk about. So that's very exciting for me. And then next week we're going to talk about a subject that I love, women in the Civil War, which is not my research, but it's also just freaking cool.
Yes.
So it's one of my favorite lectures to give. So this is going to be a little bit different though. Research is always a little bit more technical, so do forgive the technicalities of it and some of the logistics that I've got to do. But I appreciate you listening to this. So to begin, I am going to take you today on what I call like a tour of my research a little bit. We're going to do a broad overview, a taste of everything. I feel like I do a lot of stuff in my chapters, so we're just going to do a little broad overview to see if maybe anything piques your interest and you want to chat about it a little bit longer. Happy to do so. So a quick note though on organization, I am a very type A person, if you don't already know that. Very type A person, so I love me a good outline. So we're going to introduce the research a little bit more, and then we're going to look at two key groups that are involved in my research, the funders and the laborers. So just to begin it all off, in May of 1865, so this is about a month after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Union General Grant at the Battle of Appomattox in April of 1865. So just a month after Lee's surrender, Union Corporal Horace Holcomb of the 10th New Hampshire Volunteers is sitting amidst the destruction of the Confederate capital, and that is what is pictured here, and he's writing a letter to his friend Jenny, and he says, "It must be devil prompted, for the work of devastation could scarce be more complete." And although Holcomb is absolutely writing of the just recently burned Confederate capital in 1865, his sentiments echoed many others who witnessed the Civil War's destruction. For more than 4 years, you have Confederate and Union forces who are battling, they're raiding, they're bivouacking, they're foraging throughout countrysides, they are bombing, they are shelling cities and towns and showering the enemy with shot and shell. Just to give you a little bit more of an idea, a London Times correspondent goes right after the war, so right when fighting ceases about May 1865, and he's touring the South, and he writes, "There are no fences even to show where the fields were once marked off, and the trees stand gaunt and spectral in the wide waste. Their branches shot away or torn for fuel by the succession of armies, which passed up and down the sorely harassed valley. Here and there, at long intervals, a heap of charred wood and stones denote where a handsome dwelling house stood before the war. One such pile of ruins meets the eye in a fine meadow surrounded by trees. with desolate fields rank with weeds. So it is complete devastation, not complete devastation. Historians would argue with me on that, but it's pretty dramatic, especially in cities where there was shelling. This is just a picture, but just a picture of not the Shenandoah Valley, but Chancellorsville, right? Completely bombed out, just dwellings left bare and blank. These acts obviously are pulling civilian homes and businesses, churches, farms, courthouses, jails, streets, railroads, the list goes down. They're pulling them into wartime, and it leaves a trail of destruction in their wake. And because I have to do it justice, historians have already written extensively on the destruction of the Civil War. There is probably not a topic in Civil War scholarship that is not more written on, perhaps besides Abraham Lincoln. Right? So a lot of historians have already written on destruction. It is well toured. You have Charles Royster's The Destructive War, Neely's The Civil War and the Limits of Destructiveness. Both are debating the extent of war's destruction, right? Is this total war? Is it hard war? You also have, this is a more recent book, and it's one that I assigned for my graduate seminar this semester, so I'm very excited, but it's called Ruined Nation, and it's looking at the meaning of these ruins like Chancellorsville. These things stayed for a very long time after the end of the Civil War, and many liken them to the ruins of ancient Europe. But the thing is, this destruction becomes a catalyst for what happens after, for rebuilding in the war's aftermath. And that's the question that my research basically tries to tackle. How does a nation physically, right, literally torn apart by war for 4 years rebuild? Right? Who is doing the rebuilding? Who is doing it? Laborers, African Americans. Who are the funders? Who's financing all of this rebuilding? This costs a lot of money, especially after a war. And what are their motivations for doing so? So, often overshadowed by the war's devastation, this process of rebuilding, it becomes of utmost importance to Southerners, and I will say Northerners, after hostilities end. Southerners will immediately go to work, starting this crucial work of rebuilding and reconstructing their environments in the wake of America's costliest war. Black and white, men and women, recreated or created their societies in a very physical sense after the war. They're immediately rebuilding homes, businesses, jails, churches, some of which we're going to talk about, railroads. And in doing so, what I ultimately argue is they physically manifested how they want to organize their lives, how they see their lives, and who they wanted their allies to be in this rebuilding process, and who they saw their allies were going forward. In other words, rebuilding Southern spaces becomes a way for white and Black Southerners to try to exert influence and control in their post-war world, ultimately trying to determine not only what the South is going to look like, but more so, what is the U.S. going to look like? What is this new nation going to be physically after the Civil War? My research, it technically covers the entire Civil War years as well as the post-war years, so 1861 to about 1875. But the meat of it is after the war. But the thing is, during wartime, people don't know when the war is going to end. They're not like, okay, well, we'll wait till 1865 to then start rebuilding. Nobody knows when the war is going to end. So often the rebuilding process is started during wartime. I'm not going to talk about that so much today in this PowerPoint, but I did just finish up a journal article on that. So if those are questions or Q&A afterwards, I'm more than happy to chat about wartime rebuilding. So let's get this party actually started. Let's turn our attention first and foremost to the funders, those who are financing these rebuilding projects, and why. And the thing is, without a Marshall Plan like Europe after World War II or any sort of federal relief packages, Southern communities, Southern state governments, and even the federal government had to figure out how to rebuild the South and how that would be funded. One of the first examples we're going to look at is way up top. How in the world is the federal government helping this? And you might think, like, how in the world is the federal government help the South rebuild? That almost seems incongruous at times. And trust me when I say I've gone down and gone to the archives and I've talked to park rangers, and there's been some, not hostility, but not most pleasant exchanges of, like, the North did not help us at all. The federal government did not help us at all. So it's interesting to see otherwise at times. So the Union Army, backed by the federal government, initiates some of the earliest efforts of rebuilding in the South. They are going to direct Black laborers as well as the United States Construction Corps to repair Southern railroad networks. And a great example of that, not the only one, but a great example is the Western and Atlantic Railroad. This extends, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, but all the way from Chattanooga, Tennessee, down to Atlanta, Georgia. So roughly 136 miles of track, and a really important railroad at that time. It goes right to Atlanta. Huge, huge hub of infrastructure and industry for the South, second only to Richmond, Virginia, the capital city. So this particular line, it's been it's been abused by both Union and Confederate forces. If you're curious, Confederate General John Bell Hood's men are using it in October 1864. They raid it. And then you also have this guy, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, who does very much the same. He is going to raid it. He is going, in his famous Sherman neckties in November 1864, he will, without pun intended, he will tie up the railroad line. So not that same year, a few months later, in May of 1865, you have this man over here. His name is William Weirman Wright. He is the chief engineer of U.S. military railroads, and he is instructed by the upper echelons of both the military as well as those in politics to repair and reopen this line in May of 1865. Keep in mind, this is the same timeline that, Horace Holcomb is chilling, writing a letter to his friend Jenny in the capital city of the Confederacy. So basically, it's once again been about a month since Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox. So the hostilities are ceasing, if not most are already done with. And in May of 1865, he instructs 1,200 men to go to Georgia to begin work on repairing this railroad line. On May 10th, the same day the Union Army captures Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Georgia, the Union military begin rebuilding the buildings, the track, and the bridges of the Western and Atlantic. And so between the dates of May 10th, when they start this work, and July 4th, almost a month later, 1865, Wright's forces are going to replace near 36 miles of track, 80,000 cross ties, almost 3,600 feet of bridging, and use over 15,000 feet of timber. And anything about Civil War, that timber and lumber are absolutely essential, and there's not a lot of it. So timber prices are like skyrocketing by the time of the end of the war. It's used as fuel. It's used for infrastructure and construction. So it is a hot commodity during the war. All these materials, including the spikes, the iron rails, the chairs, the cross ties. If you know railroad lingo, hopefully that is some of that. To rebuild all this, as well as the labor included in the contract work, puts the cost of rebuilding this rail line at roughly, at that time in 1865, $2,569,000. And in today's money, because I did this yesterday and tried to put it into a calculator. Who knows if that calculator is right, but roughly $50 million. Right? So this is a lot of money at this time, right? And especially in US dollars. While the United States during the Civil War does not experience the near inflation that the Confederacy experiences, they are still experiencing some sort of inflation. So the Army then hands these lines this Western and Atlantic line over to Southern corporations that had it prior to the Civil War, free of charge for the materials and the labor put into many of these rebuilt Southern lines. So essentially, with the backing of the federal government, the military started beginning this post-war process of rebuilding by aiding its erstwhile enemy. Yet, you can imagine, it absolutely causes tensions. This was not a, oh great, love this, let's just give it to the Southern corporations, the former Confederacy, right? Like, no, not everybody is happy in both politics and the military, but the reasoning behind this was many see this as a gesture. Many see this as an olive branch, a way not only to economically reunite the two sections, right, but then also maybe help reconcile them, right? So to continue with our Western and Atlantic theme, Southern papers, newspapers like the Daily Intelligencer, they're elated that communication and transportation networks start up again in the North and South. They're once again restored, right? This is a big part of it for the U.S. They had a lot of trade prior to the war with these 11 states that become the Confederacy, right? A lot of economics, a lot of trade, a lot of friendships, right? So people are happy that the country is literally being knit together again by the railroad lines. But even more than infrastructure is, or not economic, is reunion, is reconciliation, right? This railroad might bring about sentiments of reconciliation between these two sections, and especially since this railroad, not this one, the Western and Atlantic, I couldn't find one of the men working on it. It was finished on the 4th of July. And they absolutely understood the meaning and significance of that date, that the track should be finished on this day, wrote Edward Francis Winslow, Brevet Brigadier General for the Union. The anniversary of one so glorious in our country's history may be perceived as an augury of a united and happy future for all of our lately disturbed country. And I will say, not all roads are aided by the Union. They had to be under Union control during wartime, and especially in 1865, right when the war is coming to an end, to get any sort of treatment, right? But many of the ones that were in Union control at the end of the war were part of major cities, right? Others include the Nashville and Chattanooga, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad. The federal government paid for their improvement, and some of them, like the Nashville and Chattanooga, not just paid for their improvement, but they added on to the line. They built it all the way to a river, a waterway, so that they could move resources and goods from that line to the water. Right? And so they paid for their improvement and then relinquished them free of charge to the Southern companies. Right? And there are stipulations. These were not just like, okay, here you go, ex-Confederates, former Confederates. Like, absolutely, those who, Southern corporations, most of them are going to be your former Confederates who are getting these railroad lines back. And they are like, so to prove your loyalty to the Union, they absolutely had to sign like an oath of loyalty. Like, yep, from here on out, I will totally be loyal to the Union. Can I have my corporation back, please? Thank you. So there are stipulations with it, but nothing crazy. That's just the oath for the future. There will be something called an ironclad oath, which some Confederates eventually, not for railroad corporations, but will have to sign, and it essentially says, I have never given aid to the Union or to the Confederacy at all, and now I'm totally loyal to the Union. Right? So basically the Southern corporations are promising loyalty in the future.
Was the plans for this laid out several months prior to the end of the war? Because Lincoln was assassinated in April, right? Okay, so this was already, they knew that the end was coming, so they were planning on this?
No, this is all, like much of the Civil War is actually really haphazard. They are learning as they go. And they're seeing what other lines do, like relinquishing them, and they're like, okay, that shows reconciliation. Maybe we'll do that same thing. So it's all.
Had nothing to do with any of the plans for.
Not specifically, no. He very much put up a policy of we want to be lenient to Southerners, and that is what the military is trying to follow with doing this.
So who was the one that made that decision?
So it's going to be Montgomery C. Meigs, Meigs, who is making this call. And it's a little bit surprising, and it's something that I'm actually looking into because he is reputably harsh on Confederates. And so there's a question of why is he then giving this freely, free of charge to them? So it's a great question. So Union occupation is going to lessen, and basically by December of 1865, all the Union military that controlled these railroads are like, get them off our hands because it costs money to do this stuff, right? And so they really want to relinquish these lines as soon as possible. And so basically, when they're finished relinquishing railroad lines, the federal government takes a step back in the process of rebuilding. And what we're going to see for the rest of this is that the baton passes to the states, to the local counties, to individual citizens to basically put all the rebuilding costs. And all had different motivations for doing so. And one of the big things that's going to throw a wrench for white Southerners or change their motivations for what they build and how they build it is that after the American Civil War, we all know that 4 million people became free, right? Over 4 million people were emancipated by the 13th Amendment. And so freedmen and women, and this is a part of my research, but it's one I'm not going to go into lengths with now, but freedmen and women are claiming space that they had never claimed before. A lot of the churches that we see, particularly this is both in Beaufort, South Carolina, the churches, the schools for African-American men and women are physically built right after the war, right? And so they are claiming space for themselves. I will say on a side note, because I encourage my students to do this, to learn more about this, please go to the only Reconstruction era National Historic Park, which is in Beaufort, South Carolina. It is the only one. It is a personal gripe of mine that there are a million Civil War ones, and while I love the Civil War, there is only one Reconstruction one, and I think that is a tragedy. And it was only recently recognized and created in 2017. Right, so this is very, very new, but also really cool, and I highly suggest you check it out. So, white Southerners, they do not care for these blatant expressions of freedmen creating their own churches, freedmen creating their own schools, right? They do not like these blatant expressions of freedom. It reminds them of their lack of control over both Southern spaces and Southern bodies. So in response to this lack of control, and in conjunction with white Southerners' fear of a rise in crime with emancipation, white Southerners, ex-Confederates turned to their local and state governments, immediately petitioning them to rebuild jails and courthouses, right? The dual halls of justice and confinement. And what they're trying to do is regain control or bodily autonomy over these African-American men and women. For instance, in South Carolina, the state government gives money, like at the time, over between $10,000 and $12,000 for the first round, which a lot of money at the time, and a lot of money for a state government that just went through 4 years of war. And so the state of South Carolina gives money to rural counties to either repair or rebuild their jails and their courthouses initially. And then there's actually another wave of funding that comes around for more. So in total, they probably give upwards of like $20,000 to $25,000 to rural counties to rebuild these spaces. And then after that funding dries up, they will be obviously go through local county taxes to do so. Cities, on the other hand, like Columbia, South Carolina, receive extra funding from the state, not only to rebuild the jails, but many realize that, oh, jails are not going to be big enough. We need a penitentiary. Right? We need a penitentiary in response to the great influx of African Americans that are streaming into cities like Columbia that are recently emancipated. And they have this idea that African Americans are tied to an increase in violence, an increase in crime, which historians have found to not be at all accurate, to be a stereotype. But nonetheless, that is the fear that a rise in crime is going to happen. The Daily Phoenix remarked, there it is, the Daily Phoenix remarked, we need a penitentiary, especially now when the whole population is elevated to the rank of freedmen. And this is one of those things where, you know, we could say like, oh, this suggests, but here it is. They are super worried about the fact that there is African Americans everywhere in the city. The population is elevated to the rank of freedmen, and they need a penitentiary. The Charleston News practically begs the state of South Carolina to construct a penitentiary and says, during the existence of the institution of slavery, the construction of society was such that the means of counteracting Black crime were arrived at without the necessity of resorting to the penitentiary system. Essentially, during slavery, there was no need to have these large jails. Things would be dealt with on plantations, right? But the war and emancipation changed all that by freeing 4 million enslaved persons. And it is necessary now to build these institutions to keep African American voices and actions under control. These same former Confederate men and women who tried to control these freedmen and women also are going to rebuild magnificent churches immediately after. They're trying to demonstrate wealth, elite status, and power. To do this, some white Southerners are going to revive their pre-war connections. They are going to head north. Oftentimes they're going to New York. There was a lot of connections between New York and many of the Confederate states who left, the 11 Confederate states, because New York is where all of their slave insurance policies were written. So there is a lot of connections between New York. Actually, a few newspapers through New York even stated at the outset of secession in 1861, when many of the states started leaving, they were like, it would be really bad if we as New Yorkers left, because we're kind of surrounded. We can't just hop our state down to the south. So there was even talk of like a New York City secession, just how close they were connected with the institution of slavery. So they go to their friends in New York, and they're trying to use reconciliation. They're like, yo, forget the recent past. We had our differences, but if you would like, you could donate to our destroyed church building, right? Southern church agents visited New York congregations, emphasizing the suffering that they endured, and also a Christian duty of charity. Help us, right? And also the valor and courage of men on both sides. Essentially, these agents encouraged reconciliation between the sections, of forgiveness of one's enemy. And they also, though, in the process, forget the causes of the war. This is going to be one aspect of what happens after wars. There's this reconciliation aspect. It's like, it was a brother's war. We both did really good. We fought valiantly. It was awesome, good times. We earned our manhood through it. But that narrative of Civil War completely forgets everything that led up to it, that caused it, that African Americans fought in the war, right? So it is a way to smooth over all those bumps and challenges, right? And it's also a way to smooth the path for money to transfer from the north to the south to churches. But I will say, there were quite a few who did not want to reconcile with the North. There are quite a few former Confederates and Southern agents who are like, I really want nothing to do with reconciliation. I want nothing to do with the North. And so they want to go to people in the North who they think would be a little more sympathetic to their Confederate cause or friendlier to their cause. And that is where you find the word of peace, right? You go to places like Baltimore, Maryland, that was a hotbed of secession, or a hotbed of secession, a sympathizer of the Confederate cause, although Maryland absolutely stayed within the Union. Baltimore still raged with Confederate sympathizers. So many from the South are going up to Baltimore, Maryland. One reverend, and I unfortunately do not have a picture of him, I could not find one. His name is William Capers, and he visits the city on behalf of his church, which was burned down in Columbia, South Carolina. It's called the Washington Street Methodist Church. And he notes that, okay, Baltimore is kind of dried up. So many people have been going to Baltimore to solicit funds to rebuild, and it's dried up. He notes appeals from Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and other states of the South have been so frequent and so urgent, and the collections have been so numerous that the good people of Baltimore who loved us have nothing left to give. Yet, even with the drained community, Capers still received 172 from the Baltimore community in 1866. Interestingly enough, though, on a side tangent, his story does not end there. He was actually sent a letter from a New Jersey preacher saying, hey, come to my church. I think you guys would get some serious money for your church to rebuild it from mine. But New Jersey, technically in the North, right? And a lot of his parishioners in Columbia, South Carolina, pushed back against him. They said, Reverend Capers, we would, quote, much rather worship God under the green arches of nature's own construction than under stately architecture provided by those who would utterly degrade and destroy us. Essentially arguing that it would be an honor to worship in the woods rather than worship under the construction in the buildings built by the enemy. Capers, on the other hand, responded. And he was like, I do not oppose Northern money in the least. In fact, he found it ironic that, quote, those who despise, persecute, and abuse us would be the financiers for our new grand Southern churches. So he absolutely goes to New Jersey. He gets a good chunk of money, and he will bring it back to Columbia, South Carolina. So these generous donations from the North absolutely help rebuild Southern churches and create elaborate buildings, which will be reconstructed. The steeples will be constructed, the arches, right? All of the statues will be brought back to demonstrate this power, connections, and wealth to those who walked by. Another point, though, of this whole idea of religion and donations in churches is that while men are going up north soliciting donations because their gender allows them to do that, you've got white, well-off Southern women who absolutely want to help out as well. I will note, white Confederate women in the South are absolutely vicious when it comes to defending the Confederacy. Historian after historian has documented that. It is really interesting. And they are so the same way after the war. They really help to rebuild churches. They do it a little bit of a different way through fairs, concerts. They host lectures and bazaars. But nonetheless, they do that. And they're typically referred to, and you'll see, the ladies, or a lady. These women remained at home typically. Oftentimes it is a slaveholding plantation or now a former slaveholding plantation. Their husband, their family had enough to support them. They did not work or labor outside of the home. And this status as lady, when I see the term lady, that term means something. They're trying to claim something there. It allows the woman leisure time that could be devoted then to some sort of benevolent work, whether it's prior to war or during wartime. Many of these, what is considered ladies, are working for your soldiers' aid societies, and we'll talk about that more next week. But in the aftermath of the war, these ladies are still trying to keep this symbol of status and wealth. And that is why they do the benevolent work of church fundraisers or bazaars to repair religious buildings. And they still use that term. They still use that term. They're trying to still show that they are a step above in society. And I will say this continues a long tradition of politically motivated, willful, and powerful ladies in the post-war. And again, I can go into that deeper next week. It's really, really fascinating. I will not digress right now, albeit I'm tempted. So here we go. Back on track. So these more elaborately rebuilt churches, I am starting to think calls into question, though, something that is difficult to talk about when you talk about the Civil War. It calls into question for me the degree of destitution in white urban Southern communities. Instead, they had money, they had connections to the North, and they invested that in grand religious structures meant to convey wealth and power. And in doing so, I also feel it does not illuminate a white Southern populace who is defeated or reconstructed in the slightest. Instead, it is the opposite. So, as this process continues, as the process of rebuilding actually gets underway, race is absolutely going to influence the process, but it is also influenced by this process of rebuilding. And in particular, you're probably thinking the wages or the lack thereof of Black laborers and the lack thereof that they received from the United States military and white Southerners to rebuild jails and streets. A really good example of this is in the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia. When the Confederate capital is consumed by fire and flame, Confederates will actually burn a lot of warehouses in the downtown area so that when the Union troops come in, they do not have access to goods, to resources, to food, et cetera, et cetera. And so Confederates burn the warehouses. The problem is, and this happened a lot in the Civil War, flames got out of control because of heavy winds that day, and it starts to spread. It starts to spread. Once, though, the Union enters, actually the first troop that enters is a United States Colored Troops regiment, and they will put out the flames. And afterwards, African Americans rejoice in the streets of the Confederate capital. They are dancing, they are singing. Thomas Morris Chester is a Black Northern War correspondent traveling with the Union Army. And he notes, quote, "Old men and women weep and shout for joy and praise God for their deliverance through means of the Union Army." Yet, the sense of deliverance, as I mentioned, it's fleeting, because the Union Army is immediately going to put many of these African American men and women to work cleaning up the fallen Confederate capital. Notices immediately start appearing in newspapers that announce, quote, "All colored men in Richmond can find work." Excuse me, all colored men in Richmond can find work, shelter, and food on application to Captain Slot. If you're curious, James Slot was the assistant quartermaster for the Army of the James in Richmond. The military eagerly wants freedmen to sign up on their own volition. They do not want to force them, but they also sense that this is not the case. They sense that they might need to force these freedmen to work. And so they include a warning in this. They said, those who do not avail themselves of the opportunity to work will be deprived of rations. So food for work is the name of the game in downtown in the Confederate capital. African American men are going to be compelled to tear down the crumbling walls, stack the bricks, clean the sludge away from the wharves in exchange for ration and shelter, food for work. Women were very much a part of this larger workforce, like the men. They too could report to the quartermaster for work. They were engaged though as cooks, as laundresses for the Union Army, and like the men, they do not receive payment for their labor, but instead military rations as leverage for their work. Now, I do want to say there was discussion of payment for these men and women, but they said that cleaning and rebuilding the ex-Confederate capital, Black laborers would be given solely food and shelter. But there was a discussion in the future for some form of financial compensation. They said, we just can't do it right now. Things are happening too quickly. We're not getting the funds in. So right now you get food and shelter, but something might come later. So the freedmen do not receive any form of payment, and they will bring their grievances to the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau is technically a department underneath the United States military. It's established in 1865, and it's really there to help African Americans transition from enslaved to emancipated, right, to freedmen. So it does a lot of other things besides labor and finding them work and jobs. It'll try to connect them with their former wives, former husbands, right? Try to connect them with their children, try to resolve any disputes. They could go to court through the Freedmen's Bureau. They could marry through the Freedmen's Bureau. But a big part of the Bureau is resolving labor issues. And so African Americans, they go to labor and they said, guys, we are not being paid. We were promised that in the future there would be some form of payment. What in the world is going on? And so when they attempted to collect their payment, they received none. And it seemed from this letter that the military thought that an accord had been struck between the freedmen and government for their labor enrichment. And I know this is really hard to read, but it says the military authorities found it necessary to provide sustenance for these persons, and such of them as were able were placed at work with the understanding that they'd only receive their rations, and they're satisfied with that. Clearly the freedmen thought differently, which is why they went to the Bureau. Right, which is why they went to the Bureau. Although the complaints to the Freedmen's Bureau make it clear that that is not what African Americans had in mind, but ultimately no payment for labor would ever be made to these freedmen for the months after the fall of Richmond. The Federal Army reinforced a system restricting African American rights in the months after the fall, illuminating the tenuous nature of freedom in the rebuilding process. And so questions of how free is emancipation, in fact, in the immediate moments after the war. Now, for my ultimate last hat trick. With these ideas of freedom and the ideas of controlling labor and restricting rights mulling around, I want to turn back to South Carolina and to the jails there, rebuilding the jails and the penitentiaries, where freedmen were actually the ones tasked with rebuilding a lot of these places of incarceration funded by state and local counties. For instance, in Orangeburg, South Carolina, you've got an English architect, his name is John Lucas, and he hires roughly 40 African American men to rebuild this local jail. These laborers, which you can see kind of from this account sheet, they range from as young as 16 to as old as 50s. Some identify their occupation as unskilled, just laborers. Some were farmhands. Others claim that they had skilled jobs. Some were builders, house carpenters, painters, blacksmiths. And depending on the laborer's experience, skilled or unskilled, right, one's daily rate could change. Most were at between 25 cents to $1, but there was also the higher end of $2.50. So they are to receive some sort of wage, but often they are not paid on the spot or even at the jail. Instead, they are paid through goods. They have to go to locally white-owned dry goods stores where they would then get items and goods in exchange for their labor at the jail. So they're not getting like hard forms of cash. they're getting resources and food instead. In the case of the Orangeburg jail, the stores, they're located nearby, and all owners, as I previously mentioned, they're white, and all of them had some sort of connection to the Confederacy. This is a great example of one of them. The store was Bull, Scoville, and Pike. Mr. Bull had 5 enslaved persons, and Scoville and Pike both joined Confederate regiments. And so they would have these grocery stores, the African American laborers would come to them, and you can imagine, you know, a lot of this is whatever Bull, Scoville, and Pike determined the price to be. So really, African American laborers, their purchasing ability is hamstrung afterwards, as is their economic power. For these men controlled who and where they could use their wages for, restricting their freedoms in the process. So, big final wrap up, and then I'll stop talking because you guys have to hear me 2 weeks from now. The process of rebuilding sits at many different intersections, I've found out. At the intersection of the military, the war, social, economic, transnational, and Reconstruction history. It's able to speak to broader themes, race, power, class, gender, all of which I've tried to poke around and demonstrate a little bit today. This paves the way for Northerners and Southerners to try and rebuild the South to each individual's liking. And they determined not only what the South will become, but what the U.S. nation will look like going forward. So I argue that truly the process of rebuilding, at the heart of it, is also a story of the nation's rebuilding. And that is the end. Thank you so much for listening to me talk about my research. I'm happy to answer questions, though. I love questions. So if you guys have questions, we're just happy to chat and have a discussion.
I have 2 questions. One, the grocery store you're saying that they had to buy there, that's essentially like script, like, oh my.
It is.
Okay, same thing. I wonder if that's where the
Very
idea came from. What came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah.
You know? And the second question is, what was the amount of Southern blacks that immigrated to the northern states? Because I read this book, Boardwalk Empire, one time about Atlantic City, and how the population of blacks that had moved up there was very instrumental in the resort theme being able to take off, because the blacks could be waiters and cooks and stuff like that. So I was just wondering what percentage of Southern blacks moved towards the north, which was very, very much impacted like the entertainment industry of the north.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the specifics. I do know that most African Americans, like after this time in Reconstruction, they went out to the West. Many of them went out to the West because they felt that is where they might have a better chance of making it. And the reason being is some went north and they found some serious hostility from Northerners. Right? So while there is a lot of abolitionist sentiment in the North during the wartime, abolitionism does not equal equality. So many white Northerners are like, oh, whoa, you can't vote. Oh, whoa, you do not be in my theater as well. Like, and so they find when they go north that there's a lot more hostility than what they anticipated. So many actually end up going out west. But you're right, they will be in the servers, the entertainers, those types of jobs. And that is where there's almost an agreement that white Northerners find that okay. You can be in the server position, that is fine. So there's definitely still prejudice going on in the north. So most actually go out west, interestingly enough.
You know, we had a presentation on Appalachian epidemics.
Dr. Chris White.
Professor.
Chris White, yes.
And in his book, I've been reading it lately, and he talks about the Civil War and the epidemic of basically the illnesses and the sicknesses that happened in the Civil War, that almost the deaths in the Civil War were probably more from epidemics than the war. I mean, the war What about the rebuilding clinics, hospitals? Did you,
So
is there any?
there is, so a lot of the hospitals actually remained. That was a target of war that was not targeted, right? That looks really, really bad. But one of the things that I do know in the post-war era, like the Freedmen's Bureau is actually going to set up a lot of hospitals for African Americans. But one of the issues comes about, they actually immediately closed down a lot of the hospitals for African Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau does, and it's not because like the sicknesses and disease clear up, but it's they want to show the federal government, like, look, we're wrapping everything up, we're taking care of it. African Americans are, they're totally healthy, so they don't need us anymore. They can totally be on their feet. So why do they need the Freedmen's Bureau? Let's wrap this up in a quick post. So it was a haste to show, like, look, check, we did it. It's all good now. Move on. And so there is a heavy increase in. There's a book by Jim Downs, and it's called Sick from Freedom. And it is really interesting in that he does say there is a massive spike after the war because they are going to many different cities. People are coming in contact with each other. Contagion is spreading much easier. And the fact that the Freedmen's Bureau quickly dissipates in terms of hospitals for African Americans, it really leads to a rise of disease. And there's not much help for them from the federal government or the military. And I will also say there is a general distrust of those types of authorities in general, so they're hesitant to even go. But that's interesting. I need to read Chris's book. I know he's got a few chapters on the Civil War there. One of the other interesting things is, I don't know if he talks about the opioid crisis that happens, the opioid crisis that happens. There's a big opioid crisis after the Civil War. Some say like it's the first opioid crisis, but a lot of these men, Confederate and Union veterans, are all, they were treated with opioids during the war. And so there is a difficulty of them going through withdrawal. They look for medicines. Even newspapers will have ads like, here's the Healy's cure, here's the antidote to cure opium withdrawal. And because there are no government regulations and authority at that time, a lot of the men, the veterans, will be like, oh yeah, it totally worked. My withdrawal symptoms are cured. And that's because most of the time the antidotes had opioid in them. So it would subside.
One of the comments, your presentation, is, and of course I honor your dissertation and your work here. It just helps me to, in a summary, that's what I'm trying to say about, I'm not just saying it's a summary.
Oh, no.
But the fact that Southern white and entrepreneurship and corporations and greed and money and the ultimate issue of slavery is so impacted in the Reconstruction. I mean, it's just, I mean, we all have really read different things, seen different things, and we're now caught in a day when it's getting right back in our face again. The reality but I just am struck by how the Reconstruction nuances really must have impacted. Yes. That's what I thank you for that.
I appreciate that.
Freaking that.
I think a lot of it is, and I asked my students, I was like, how many of you study Reconstruction? Or how, and the common phrase is, we learned it over Christmas break. We learned it over summer break. And I'm like, that's what I thought. And I think a lot of it is because it's so confusing, right? The war is 4 years. It's so much easier to grasp. There's armies you're following certain people. Reconstruction almost seems very chaotic. There's so many moving parts at the top and the bottom, so it's hard, I think, for people to grasp. And I hope I did kind of show it is confusing. There's a lot of people have individual goals in this, and that's what they're trying to put on the landscape. Sorry.
Question. A question or a comment. The question is about how long did the federal government's involvement in Reconstruction last? And the comment about Reconstruction is that the Southerners who believed that slavery was correct never changed their minds. The systems changed, but
Oh,
the
yeah.
minds were changed.
Yeah.
And we still have people today that feel the same way. So the question becomes, how do you change that? How do you change people's minds? How can you say that you're a Christian and that slavery is okay? How can you do this work? That's the comment. But about how long did the federal government involvement in this Reconstruction last? And then what happened to those people once given food and shelter in the way?
Option. Unfortunately, it was pretty quick, much like the hospitals of the Freedmen's Bureau. It lasted maybe 5 years. For those specific things, they were also giving them food, shelter, and the Freedmen's Bureau will last up until, 1870, I want to say 73. And so it'll be around, but it won't be as powerful, especially because after Lincoln, you have Andrew Johnson that comes into power, and he is not friendly to, honestly, slaveholders or African-American laborers. He is resentful of slaveholders, and he does not care for African-Americans in the slightest, and so he is not a friend to them, and he does not want to see the Freedmen's Bureau actually keep going on and doing its work, and so him and Congress are fighting over that constantly, but as they fight, the Freedmen's Bureau becomes weakened and weakened and weakened, and then ultimately what we see is the Freedmen's Bureau dissipates, and it's the military that's actually like keeping these African Americans safe in the South. The majority of the military, which the military stays up until 1877. There's not as many of there was during like 4 years of wartime, but they stay up to 1877. I mean, some places in the South is occupied still. But what we see is that the majority of the U.S. military that's down there are United States colored troops. They were the ones that their service had not ended yet, or they re-upped their service. And so African Americans in the South found protection with those USCT troops. And that is really the last remaining vestige. It will end, some scholars call it a corrupt bargain, but essentially there is a deal where Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the president in 1877. And in order to get a Republican president, they had to agree that all US military troops are now put out of the South. And that was a big concession in 1877. So, good question.
Was there, one of the factors involving getting courthouses and such erected, I would imagine that there were a lot of disputes over land, like property lines and such. Was that a big impact? Because if it's barren, I mean.
Yeah, that's a good point. Honestly, I have not looked into that at all. I do know, I mean, I have not come across any that there are land disputes necessarily. They typically know, especially if like their houses were burned next to each other. They know where those land markers are. Honestly, I've never come across that, and that could be an interesting avenue.
Like they're
Try to budget a little bit.
2 feet over, you're talking thousands of acres.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. I had not thought of that. Other thoughts? Well, thanks all for listening to me. I appreciate it. I'll be here next week.